The Sumerians, ancient Egyptians, ancient Greeks, and ancient Chinese. Civilizations with different cultures, distant geographical locations, and beliefs. But they all share one common characteristic, which changed the course of history. So, in this video, we will be discovering the surprising connection that shaped the foundations of civilization. Mesopotamia, a fertile and rich land where the oldest civilizations were born, grew, and perished. These lands, not only underground but also above ground, harbored many cultural riches that could not be shared in one way or another. Throughout history, many kingdoms and empires were established on these lands, but the fate of many of them turned out to be the same, and they faded into the dusty pages of history. Nevertheless, what one of them contributed to humanity in terms of technological and cultural developments outweighs the others. As you might guess, I am talking about the Sumerians. The Sumerians, one of the oldest civilizations, lived in southern Mesopotamia, now known as southern Iraq, between approximately 4000 and 2000 BC, corresponding to the Bronze Age. Some historians have suggested that the Sumerians were a North African people who migrated from the Sahara to the Middle East and were responsible for the spread of agriculture in the Middle East. However, with strong evidence pointing to the first farmers coming to the Fertile Crescent, this suggestion is often overlooked. It will be due to the fertility of the land that the Sumerians quickly grew, establishing large cities and becoming the dominant power in Mesopotamia. However, managing large populations in cities with the technology of that time was difficult, if not nearly impossible. At the same time, due to the strategic position of the Sumerians in terms of trade, commerce developed, and keeping track of traded goods became increasingly challenging. Therefore, the Sumerians invented what we now know as the four basic operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. This way, they could engage in trade more easily, and at the same time they carved shapes on clay tablets with nail-like tools to record and document the developments in their growing and evolving empire. They assigned meanings to these drawn shapes, thus, for the first time in history, translating information into a written text and recording it. However, the achievements of the Sumerians were not limited to what I have mentioned so far. In order to store the tons of grains they produced on these fertile lands, the Sumerians built large pyramid-like structures called ziggurats. While the lower parts of these great pyramids stored grains, the upper parts laid the foundation for astronomy as they observed the stars. However, the Sumerians were unable to cope with the waves of the Great Migration coming from the east, and eventually lost their lands to another ancient civilization known as the Assyrians. After the Sumerians, the civilization that contributed at least as much to humanity in history is the ancient Egyptians. Egyptians, as the name suggests, were an ancient civilization spread around half of Egypt, where the Nile River reaches the sea. The Egyptians adapted very well to the harsh conditions of the desert and became a civilization closely identified with it. Due to limited food, water, and fertile land, the only place Egyptians could produce food was the delta of the Nile River. However, there was a problem. The Nile River flooded at certain times of the year, and the entire year's harvest was going to waste. This not only could lead to problems like famine, but also posed a barrier to the development of villages and towns, submerging them underwater. However, the Egyptians had another plan. If they could predict in advance when these floods would occur, they could take precautions against them. With this logic in mind, the Egyptians discovered the calendar, allowing them to anticipate when the Nile River would flood and take preventive measures. This invention significantly increased control and awareness among the people. The Egyptians didn't stop there. They also built the first known ship in history. What's even more interesting is that after the pharaohs died, the Egyptians would remove all the organs from their bodies except the heart. They even turned the brain into liquid using a fork-like metal rod and drained it through the nose. Yes, it may seem repulsive to us, but these were their traditions, and there was a fascinating reason behind them. Egyptians believed that after death, they would be judged by the gods and reborn. Therefore, during this judgment, to ensure they didn't lie to the gods using their brains, all organs were removed, leaving only the hearts for them to speak the truth. Then, they were mummified. Thanks to these religious traditions, the Egyptians laid the foundations of medicine and contributed invaluable knowledge to human anatomy. So, what did they do with these mummies, do you think? They built massive pyramids to store them and equipped the interiors with traps to prevent unauthorized entry, demonstrating that the Egyptians were more advanced in architecture and engineering than we might think. Another significant civilization is the ancient Greeks. They lived in present-day Greece, the Aegean Islands, and the surrounding Ionian region. When I say they, I refer to the ancient Greeks, who were not a single country, but rather a society comprised of small and scattered city-states engaged in trade across a vast geography. Some individuals in this society grew weary of excessive prosperity and abundance because there were no major wars or threats at that time. Faced with boredom and having plenty of leisure time, curious people began asking questions about life, creation, and matter. They questioned and questioned. They queried. They even reached a point where they sought a cause beneath everything. They looked at everything with extreme skepticism and argued that there must be a reason for everything. Thus, philosophy emerged for the first time in ancient Greece. Later, those who practiced philosophy, namely the philosophers, started to investigate natural events and explore the underlying causes. Although there were not many sources available at that time and technology was underdeveloped, they couldn't conduct complex experiments. However, they delved deeper into thought, engaged in mental experiments, and tried to explain the shapes in nature. They laid the foundations of mathematics and geometry by attempting to explain natural phenomena. One of the greatest and most important examples is Pythagoras, who, by discovering the Pythagorean theorem, laid the foundations of mathematics and geometry. Instead of attributing rainfall to the gods' tears, they searched for a more realistic cause behind it and continued asking questions. This laid the groundwork for natural science, the foundation of today's science. One of the most important and classic philosophical questions of that time was the concept of arche, the question of what the first substance is. Many different philosophers provided detailed and interesting answers. According to Thales, the arche is water, primarily influenced by water's role in supporting life. Another intriguing idea comes from Democritus, who believed that the arche is the atom, the smallest building block of matter. Yes, you heard it right. Democritus proposed the existence of atoms around 2,300 years ago. Of course, Democritus's atomic model was not accepted because he only proposed it based on thought and did not conduct any experiments. Or more precisely, it couldn't be proven due to the conditions of that time. Although we now know he was wrong, his ability to make such a prediction so many years ago holds immense importance in terms of science. Another significant influence from ancient Greece that resonates with us today is democracy. As known, in ancient Athens, the local people had the right to choose their leaders, and this system laid the foundation for contemporary political and governmental systems. The Sumerians laid the foundations for writing and mathematics, the Egyptians for medicine, and the Greeks for geometry and philosophy. However, how can we advance further in science without documenting this knowledge in written sources to ensure its permanence? This is where ancient China comes into play. Ancient China was a state located in the present-day Chinese territory, but on a smaller scale. The discoveries made by this civilization were somewhat different from those of other civilizations. How so? As mentioned earlier, other ancient civilizations made discoveries more focused on abstract concepts, thoughts, and systems. However, things worked a bit differently in ancient China. Although it is not well known how, the Chinese were the civilization that first invented paper and the printing press. After inventing the printing press, the Chinese printed only 2,000 books. This may seem like a lot for that time, but you will now understand why it was not. The discovery of paper and the printing press actually holds a very important place in history. Because before the invention of paper as we know it, if you wanted to record any information, you would first need to find a way to obtain papyrus. Since the production of papyrus was not an easy task, written texts, books, and parchments were only found in specific places. For example, in medieval Europe, before the printing press, only the church and cathedrals had access to scriptures. However, after the invention of the printing press by the Chinese, it somehow reached Europe and revolutionized the continent. With the arrival of the printing press in Europe, there was a book explosion. Over 2 million copies of the Bible were duplicated in just 20 years. This means that during that time, every 3-person family had access to one Bible. Previously, since the Bible was only available in churches and cathedrals, the public was not considered knowledgeable about religion. Everything uttered by religious figures was declared sacred, and people unquestionably believed in it. One of the most well-known examples is the medieval Catholic Church's unnecessary taxation of the public, or attempts to sell plots of land in heaven, which was not stated in the Bible. However, after the Bible became accessible to everyone through the printing press, the public's literacy level began to rise. People started reacting to such religious events, and the influence of the church on the public gradually diminished. For centuries, people had been deceived by the church, but with the availability of the Bible, they began to realize this. This paved the way for the Renaissance and Reform movements, leading to a cultural, scientific, and artistic revolution in Europe. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe.